Hello and welcome to my channel. Clearly you have nothing better to do if you stumbled upon this video. Thus, I will do my best to amuse you with another batch of creepy and disturbing stories from the internet. Tonight, we will be exploring a bunch of supposedly true stories that taxi drivers have shared on Ni-chan, otherwise known as 2chan, a Japanese anonymous message board. Some of the accounts are disturbing and truly puzzling in nature. Thus, as always, viewer discretion is very much advised. Now with that said, join me as we disembark on a journey on Route 666. It was a particularly cold day in a rural part of Fukushima, where I worked as a taxi driver. The kind of day that makes you want to stay indoors by the warmth of a fire. The rain had stopped, but the thick grey clouds blanket remained, covering up the entire sky and making it seem like it's late evening, while in actuality it's still 15 o'clock in the afternoon. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling silence. I was parked near the train station, waiting for the next fare, when it suddenly appeared. She was an older woman, her face weathered and pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She wore a long, tattered coat that looked like it hadn't seen wash in years. Her hair was silver, tangled and wild, and her hands pale and shaking, clutching a small, faded photograph. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should offer her a ride, or maybe call an ambulance. But something in her gaze told me I had no choice. "Young man, can you please take me to the old cemetery?" I was about to ask if she really wants to go cemetery gardening in this kind of weather, but immediately checked myself. She will pay regardless, I thought. All I need is yen. She can drench herself in rain for the entire day and then be sick and bedridden for a week afterwards for all I care. I glanced at the photograph she handed me, a black and white image of a young man, his face blurred with age and time. The cemetery was a good hour's drive away, a place I avoided after dark, especially with its reputation for being haunted. But despite the twilight caused by the grey clouds blanketing the sky, it was still daytime. Technically. "Sure," I said, opening the door for her. "Get in." As she settled into the back seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the taxi grew colder, and the silence between us almost suffocating. I don't know why. Maybe because the disheveled look and the grey hair of this particular old lady simply creeped me the hell out. Nevertheless, I started the engine and we drove off. The road to the cemetery was winding and deserted, the kind of place where the past seems to linger in every shadow. The woman sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Every now and then she would glance at the photograph, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Who is he, if I may ask?" I said, breaking the silence. "Your son?" She shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "No, my husband. He died in the tsunami. They never found his body. Oh, I see. My condolences then, I responded. I felt a chill run down my spine. The story of the tsunami was still fresh in everyone's minds, the memories of that day haunting the region. When we finally reached the cemetery, the sky was still grey, but for the most part the rain had stopped, aside from occasional drop or two. The grey twilight from the rain clouds seemed to underscore the grey and weathered look of the tombstones. We stopped near the main gate entrance to the cemetery. "This is where he is buried," she said, her voice trembling. "But I never got to say goodbye." "I'm sorry to hear that," I responded. "Here we are, Nani Cemetery entrance," I said to the old lady. "That would be 3,500 yen, ma'am." She handed me the banknotes, and I watched as she stepped out of the taxi car, her figure slowly walking to the cemetery, carrying a bag with what must have been gardening tools and flowers or candles of some sort to put on her relative's grave. She walked slowly to her relative's grave, the photograph still clutched tightly in her other hand. I stayed in the car, my eyes fixated on her, the unease growing with every passing second. Suddenly the ground seemed to shake beneath me. The earthquake lasted only for a couple of seconds, and then it stopped. When I looked back through the side window, the lady was nowhere to be seen. "Huh?" I was surprised. Maybe she fell over or something. I climbed out of my car. Older people especially are often prone to breaking their arms and legs when falling. It is very dangerous. I ran through the gates inside the cemetery to check if the old lady was alright, but she was nowhere to be seen. There was only one main road leading to the cemetery, and a bunch of small gravestones on both sides. You could see a considerable distance in all directions, but she couldn't have gone anywhere in these few moments, and yet this old lady was nowhere to be seen. Puzzled and unsure of what to think, I shouted for the old lady a few times, but the cemetery did seem empty. There was no mistaking it. One moment the lady was walking on the main path through the cemetery, and she was gone the next. Where? I have no idea. I didn't know what to think. I came back to my car and checked for the money that she gave me. At least the banknotes were real, if a bit worn down from usage. Still, yen is yen, even if it looks a bit too crumpled up for my liking. Not wanting to stay too long in front of this accursed cemetery and feeling more than a little disturbed about this incident, I promptly started my car and drove off back to town. After finishing my shift, I went to drink with my colleagues at a local izakaya. I vented my frustrations to them. We all wined and dined rather well that night. Luckily for me, it's been at least a year since that event, and nothing strange has happened to me since. But then again, I refused to take my customers to cemeteries and other strange locales after this particular predicament, so maybe that helped. Driving a taxi in Tokyo is a blend of routine and unpredictability. You meet all kinds of people, some talkative, some silent, some unforgettable, and some you wish you could forget. But the night of the disappearing passengers was unlike any other night I had ever experienced. It was a rainy autumn evening, the streets slick with water, reflecting the neon lights of the city. The rain had a way of quieting the usual buzz of Tokyo, giving the night an eerie, muted atmosphere. I was parked near Shibuya Crossing, waiting for my next fare, when a man in a suit approached my taxi. A salaryman, no doubt, I thought to myself. He had a blue tight-fitting suit, white shirt underneath, loafer shoes, you know the type. "Good evening, sir," he said as he got in, his voice calm and measured. "Take me to the old district near Asakusa, please." I nodded, starting the meter and pulling away from the curb. The man settled into the back seat, his eyes fixated on the passing scenery. He had a certain air about him, well-dressed, with an old-fashioned briefcase and an aura of someone who belonged to a different era. As we drove, the rain intensified and the streets became less crowded. The man remained silent, his gaze distant. We reached the old district, a place where traditional wooden houses still stood amidst the modern buildings, and I pulled over. "Here we are," I announced. To my surprise, the back seat was empty. I turned around, thinking maybe he had quietly slipped out, but there was no sign of him. The briefcase, however, was still here, lying on the seat. Confused and slightly unnerved, I stepped out of the taxi and looked around, but the man was nowhere to be seen. I got back into the car, the briefcase now a troubling reminder of this strange event. I decided to take it to the nearest police station after my shift has ended. Then I drove back towards the city center, trying to shake off the unease. It wasn't long before another fare approached, a young couple drenched from the rain, waving me down with urgency. They got in, breathless and laughing. "We need to get to the Hachioji area," the man said, his arm around the woman. I nodded, relieved for the distraction. They chatted animatedly as I drove, their voices a comforting reminder of normalcy. But as we approached their destination, something odd happened. The rain seemed to form a dense curtain around us, and the air grew colder. I pulled up to the address they had given me. "Here you go," I said, glancing in the rear-view mirror. But the back seat was empty again. The couple had vanished without a trace, just like the first passenger. My heart pounded in my chest. This can't be happening, I thought to myself. I checked the back seat, but there was no sign of them, no belongings left behind this time. I drove to the nearest police station, my nerves frayed. I wanted to hand over the briefcase to them and explain my predicament, but I couldn't find it. Did one of my passengers took it? But the passengers themselves disappeared in a puff of smoke. What is going on? I remember freaking out while nervously smoking a cigarette right in front of the police station. Luckily for me, this was late into the night and it was raining, so nobody cared. I decided not to report it to the police. Best case, they won't believe anything I say. Worst case, they will conclude that I have lost it and that I am properly deranged and order me to get myself evaluated and take away my driving license. It would be such a hassle. No, this simply won't do. I am not crazy, I told myself. I remember contemplating my next action for a while as I continued to smoke, standing right in front of the police station while leaning on my car. After I got tired from standing and smoking in the rain, I drove off from the police station with more questions than answers. The rain had let up slightly, but the streets still felt eerily quiet. I decided to take one last fare for the night, hoping to end on a normal note. As I drove back towards Shibuya, an elderly woman waved me down. She got in, her hands shaking slightly as she gave me an address. "Can you take me to the cemetery near Ueno Park?" she asked, her voice frail. "What? At this hour? Ma'am, you do realize that the cemeteries are closed this late in the evening? I'll pay triple the price," the lady said, pulling out a bunch of yen notes and waving them around at my face. Well, I wasn't going to say no to that, I mumbled, thinking that some extra yen is always welcome as patronage for my hard and worthy efforts ferrying some random people during the small hours of the night. Not to mention, right now I would be properly working the infamous graveyard shift, literally. I hesitated but nodded, immediately taking the yen notes from the lady. The last 2 ghostly passengers didn't pay for the ride, and I was desperate for yen. Don't judge me. After starting the meter, I drove off. The drive was silent, the old woman staring out the window, lost in thought. When we arrived, I turned to tell her that we have reached the destination, but the woman was already gone. The back seat was empty yet again. I jumped from my seat in fright, as I nearly got an aneurysm, as I realized that I was driving an apparition in my back seat yet again. I think this was the first time I legit experienced a panic attack. I was shaking, hyperventilating, my eyesight went dark for a moment or two, and I felt like I'm about to faint. After about a minute or two, I still felt like I was freaking the hell out, but it was somewhat manageable. My heart raced as I got out of my car and looked around. The cemetery was quiet, the gravestones illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. But there was no one around me. For all intents and purposes, it seemed that I had driven here alone. I got back into my taxi, my hands trembling. I had heard of haunted places, ghost stories told by other drivers, but I had never put much stock in them. Now, I wasn't so sure. I mean once, yeah, but 3 ghostly passengers using a taxi in downtown Tokyo of all places. I wasn't sure of what to think, except that I need a drink if I am to consider this proposition. What I was sure of is that I am done for the night. And thus, I promptly jumped back into my car and sped to the only place I knew for sure that would bring some positivity into my late-night antics. My trusty Lawson's 24/7 Kombini, where I proceeded to grab the biggest and tastiest bottle of sake with great haste, and at least 3 different prepare meal plates, which I asked the cashier lady to reheat in the microwave for me. Not to mention I raided their chocolate and snack section too, and I bought at least 4 pieces of their fried chicken on a stick. Lawson snacks are the absolute best, I'm telling you. They always make me smile when times are hard. After paying for all these items, I proceeded to talk the cashier's ear off about my tonight's adventures. She was a pretty and kind lady in her late 20s or early 30s, and she humored my ramblings with a soft smile, probably because this was during late hours of the night and she was bored. あ、そうだね。ああ、そうか。そうか。あ、そうですね。でしょ? The company lady reassured me that as long as I returned the next day to this particular company and told her about how things would go during my next shift, All will be well. I thanked her profusely for listening to my tale and bowed respectfully a bunch of times and apologized for annoying her. But she just giggled and said it was fine. She said that I'm always welcome to come back and visit this particular company in the future and buy some more snacks whenever I feel down. I drove home in a daze, the rain finally stopping as dawn approached. I parked the taxi and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of tonight's events. It was clear that something beyond the ordinary was at play, something I couldn't explain. Or perhaps I'm simply losing it. At home I proceeded to binge on my snacks while drinking copious amounts of sake, while watching NHK late-night slice-of-life dramas, trying to wash out the frightening memories of what just happened. The next night, I found myself back at Shibuya Crossing, the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling that the disappearing passengers were a sign, some sort of message from the other side. I mean, ghosts or no ghosts, I needed the money, and thus I was back to work, whether I wanted or not. And as I waited for my next fare, I couldn't help but wonder who or what would step into my taxi next. This happened, what, around 15, 17 years by now, if I'm not mistaken? It messed me up pretty badly, to the point where it's been more than a decade, and I still haven't completely got over it. It was a rainy night in Kyoto, the kind of rain that soaks through your clothes and chills you to the bone if you're outside and without umbrella. I had been driving my taxi for hours, navigating through the narrow, winding streets of the old city. The rain seemed to wash away the usual bustling atmosphere, leaving the city quiet and deserted. No dice, no more customers tonight for me, it seems. Oh well, I was about to call it a night when I spotted a figure standing at the edge of a narrow alleyway. She was a young woman, drenched and shivering, her hair plastered to her face. She wore a simple white dress that clung to her body, and her eyes were wide with an expression I couldn't quite place. Fear, desperation, or maybe something else. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. She nodded, not saying a word, and climbed into the back seat. As she settled in, I noticed her bare feet, and the mud streaked up her legs. I handed her a towel from the glove compartment, which she accepted with a silent nod. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful despite the unease creeping up my spine. She handed me a small piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. It was a location I recognized. A remote, wooded area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a place people usually went, especially not at this time of night. I had my reservations about this, but I needed the money, so I nodded and started driving. After all, what do I care if some broad suddenly decides to turn off her lamp tonight, of all nights, for one reason or another? Not like she's the first or the last. And it's not my job to counsel people out of their personal abyss. Those were my thoughts as I shifted the gear and started to drive. The rain continued to pour down, and the streets grew darker and more deserted as we left the city behind. The woman sat silently in the back seat, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. Her silence was unnerving, but I tried to focus on the road. As we approached the outskirts of Kyoto, the rain intensified and the road became more treacherous. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creating twisted shadows in the headlights. I glanced at the woman in the rear-view mirror, and she was still staring blankly ahead, her face pale and expressionless. The GPS guided us to a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the forest. The further we went, the more isolated we became. The only sound was the rain pounding against the roof of the car and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the address. It was an old, dilapidated 7-story building, barely visible through the thick fog and rain. The windows were all boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked like this building was abandoned at the very least for a year or two. Probably we should add a 0 to that number to get closer to a time when it was still lived in. Anyway, we're here, I said, turning to face her. Now if you think this would be a part of the story where the taxi driver is usually frightened, there's no one there. No, that's not what happened. Make no mistake, oh, she was there sitting on the back seat. But she didn't move. She continued to stare out the window, her expression unchanged. I couldn't exactly blame her for not wanting to leave the warm comfort of my car. It was raining cats and dogs out there. Not to mention the property was abandoned. There are no houses for at least a few kilometers in every direction. Almost no cars are going down this road. And it's the dead of night. I hesitated, then got out of the car and walked around to open the door. Miss, we're here, I repeated, my voice shaky. Unless you would like me to take you back to town, I said. She slowly turned to look at me, her eyes hollow and distant. Oh, it's fine. She stepped out of the car, and as she did, I noticed something strange. Her dress was completely dry, despite the rain. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light or my tired eyes. She began to walk towards the house, her steps slow and deliberate. I watched as she reached the front door and then opened it, and without turning back, she went inside this abandoned multi-story apartment building. The windows, I think pretty much all of them had shattered glass or no glass at all. They were completely dark. Couple that with darkness of the night, the rain, the isolation of this place, it seemed as if the many windows of this building were eyes staring down at you, and when you tried looking at them, the darkness inside those windows seemed endless, trying to swallow you whole. I shook away my head, frightened, cursing myself as I stopped gazing at the windows. I glanced around, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease. I wanted to leave, but something compelled me to follow her. I mean, I still stand by my earlier statement. It's not my place to save everyone who has had enough with life. But this ain't right. I may be a knee-chaner, but I still need to sleep at night. As it currently stands, I was basically complicit in the ending of this young lady's life, since I brought her in this place to begin with. No, this does not sit right with me. And another thing, she left without payment. You can call me cheapskate or whatever, but in the words of a famous stand-up comedian, now, while I'm sorry for the ride, the church does not provide. I grabbed a flashlight from my car and quickly made my way towards this damned house. The front door creaked open at my touch, revealing a dark, musty interior. The floor was filled with garbage. The walls painted with graffiti. The usual look of the abandoned properties. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The sound of shattered glass and other junk cracked under my shoes, adding to the eerie atmosphere. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. There was no answer, only the sound of the rain coming from outside. As I walked further inside, I saw an old abandoned stairway leading upstairs, with many doors on each floor, many of whom hold barely on their hinges, with dark and empty squares they meant to cover, inviting me to go inside these rooms. Countless nightmarish possibilities were waiting for me in the darkness. The house was empty and abandoned, yet still, for some reason I felt as if I was being watched. "Hey, miss, where are you? What are you doing here anyway?" I shouted into the darkness. "Go away!" I heard her shouting from above, as her quick footsteps followed, climbing up the stairs. I nearly got a heart attack, as I didn't really expect to hear a response. "Crap, she really is going to do it," I mumbled to myself as I started racing up the stairs, trying not to lose my footing. As the staircase was missing concrete in places, seemed dangerously unstable, not to mention there were lots of garbage strewn all over. "Hey, stop! Wait!" I shouted as I tried to move as fast as the environment allowed me. "Don't do this! Wait! Let me talk to you at least. I can help you." I wasn't sure what to say in this situation, so if you think I was shouting some generic nonsense. At that moment, I remember feeling the same. I mean, what the hell are you supposed to say to a person who's about to jump off the roof? Huh? Like, really? Better question, how did this lady manage to make her way up this fast? I remember wondering to myself. Especially because, at least for me, it seemed that I was climbing this damn staircase for all my life, really. Not to mention being almost in complete darkness, and only my crappy flashlight producing a thin ray of light made navigating this treacherous building all the more difficult. This young lady must be very familiar with the layout of this place, I remember thinking to myself. That, or she must have a hell of a lot better flashlight than me. Either way, my heart pounded in my chest as I made my way upstairs, each step more reluctant than the last. As I climbed to the last floor, finally, apart from the usual empty dark halls without doors creeping me out, there was a small rusty metal ladder leading up the roof. Perhaps the view will be better upstairs, I remember thinking ironically, while without much hesitation starting climbing the precarious-looking thing, as I heard the most terrifying scream. I almost fell to the floor from a mini heart attack it gave me. Well, I remember thinking to myself, defeat screen wasted. You have died. GG. Total annihilation, without that much of a rush, but still rather hastily I climbed back and carefully navigated my way downstairs to the first floor. Considering that the building had around 7 floors, it took me a while to reach the entrance. And there she was. Outside, a few meters to the right, her body lay on the grassy ground, hands and feet contorted into unnatural angles, her face looking up the sky with a terrified expression. Of course I called the police. They took their sweet time to arrive, though. I thought at first that they would question me extensively, and I had some reservations about that maybe the cops will consider me a suspect, that I pushed her from the roof or something. But no, as far as the deputy and his colleagues were concerned, this was a routine call, and they weren't about to rush head-on through the pouring rain for a person who's most likely dead already. Thus, they took their time to arrive. An hour and a half, to be precise. Me and the deputy superintendent were leaning on his squad car as we both smoked a cigarette, discussing of what had just transpired. The deputy was somewhat casual and a little apprehensive as he relayed some of his conjectures and misgivings for me. You never heard this from me, but typically people offing themselves are not considered a high priority call for us. Now don't get me wrong, the deputy inhaled some more of the cigarette smoke, then puffed a few clouds before choking out another sentence or two. I don't take pleasure in this, you know. It is always regrettable and tragic when a person's life ends prematurely, and it would be nice if we could help it. But I only have 2 hands and feet, as you can see, and I can only do so much throughout the day. We barely have enough funding to solve cases for the living, let alone the dead. We receive calls about incidents like this in this particular property at least once every 2 months, sometimes once a month, the deputy said, looking at the cigarette before inhaling some more smoke. I don't know what's with this place, to be honest, but it seemed to attract lost souls. Bad mojo, no bueno, or something like that. Spent many days wondering why those people choose this abandoned property in particular, of all places. In my opinion, this place should have been demolished years ago. The deputy pointed with his thumb. Of course, the declining economy and the ruling party isn't helping matters either. The Prime Minister should look into this as far as I'm concerned. Those people were probably indebted to their eyeballs to the local Yakuza, or have deep-seated issues with their family members or something. Either way, I'm glad that you reported the incident, sir. You did the right thing. We'll call the coroner to come over and handle the body when he feels like it. You may go now. I imagine you'll be needing a drink or two. I know I will, once we're done with the paperwork. We will call you if we discover something of note or have some more questions for you. Take care, the deputy waved at me. Oh, one more thing, the deputy uttered when I turned around and was about to leave. Can I borrow a light? Mine seemed to have stopped working. Of course, officer. I said, lighting up another cigarette for him. One apparently wasn't enough. In his line of work, I could understand. I never spoke of that night to anyone, but the memory of this particular incident stayed with me for some time. I continued my job, of course, because I needed the money, but I was always wary of the passengers I picked up, especially on rainy nights. The line between life and death seems to be a thin one indeed. Naturally, I still struggle with many what-ifs and could-haves for a long time, and every time it rained, I couldn't help but remember this young lady. As I looked into my rear-view mirror, often I was half expecting to see her sitting there on the back seat, looking at me with this empty and dismissing gaze of hers. Damn, man. I don't know what to say, except that they don't pay me enough for this job. And that's the end of today's show. Truly dark and terrifying tales were on tonight's podcast. Hopefully you found them interesting. Of course, since these stories were found on 2chan, a Japanese anonymous message board, I wouldn't put much stock in them personally. Everything heard in this video is flat out lies and fiction, as far as I can tell. However, I thought that these 2chan posts were noteworthy enough for me to translate and share with you, since I find taxi drivers fascinating, especially those working at night time. Thanks for listening. Please comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.